Chapter 4, The Evolution, Discrepancies between their early and later logic. The portrait of Socrates that most readers carry from high school seminars and popular introductions is a single, enduring image, a man who asks pointed questions, exposes contradictions, and leaves his interlocutors, often both puzzled and morally unsettled, standing in the dust of their own assumptions. What follows in the pages here is an attempt to trace a more intricate arc, one that moves from the brisk Elencus of Athens' younger philosopher to a more expansive and, some would say, more metaphysically ambitious form of dialogue. The evolution we witness is not a simple maturation from a clever critic to a wiser sage, it is a set of shifts in logic, goal, and method that historians and philosophers have long debated. The result is a catalogue of discrepancies, apparent contradictions, tensions, and reorientations that illuminate how the Socratic project changes shape across the core texts and across the voices that tell the story. The puzzle begins with a deceptively simple observation. In the early dialogues of Plato, and to a lesser extent in Xenophon, Socrates is the master of Elencus, the cross-examinatory method that reveals ignorance, inconsistency, and the paucity of useful definitions. In these scenes, the logic is direct and utilitarian. The aim is not to assert a robust theory of knowledge but to puncture pretensions, to strip away confident assertions until the interlocutor admits some form of ignorance or incoherence. The technique is sharp, procedural, and almost surgical. Pose a shared term: what is virtue? What is piety? What is courage? Test its application to various cases, and expose a failure to meet a stable criterion. The result is epistemic humility, sometimes genuine, sometimes strategically deployed to kindle a moral awakening. Yet as we move deeper into the Platonic corpus, the logic begins to look less like a steady, transparent ascent and more like a series of reorientations. The later dialogues introduce long chains of reasoning, explicit definitions, and systematic consideration of what the things themselves are. The form of inquiry widens from a practical, diagnostic exercise to a dialectical enterprise aimed at uncovering universals, justifications, and the conditions under which virtue and knowledge can be made stable for the soul. In this shift we encounter a set of discrepancies that challenge the easy narrative of a constant Socratic method. What counts as a sound argument in one text may look questionable in another. What counts as knowledge in one phase may be dismissed as superstition in another. What it means to justify a claim about virtue or the good may diverge across works and genres. Discrepancies in the sphere of method, Elencus versus dialectic. The earliest phase of Socratic engagement, as Plato presents it, rests on the Elencus, a patient, relentless asking of questions designed to refute a definition by showing that it cannot cover the cases it purports to cover. The logic is procedural rather than doctrinal. The interlocutor's error proves a lack of coherent criteria, after which the engaged party is left with the sting of aporia, a sophisticated version of I don't know. The virtue of this approach is procedural transparency. A layperson can watch the method operate, see the definitions fail to withstand scrutiny, and, if the test is properly administered, either revise the definition or withdraw the claim to knowledge. The later dialogues, however, often display a broadened scope of inquiry. The method is no longer merely to test definitions but to construct them, to classify kinds of knowledge, and to argue about necessity and universals. When Socrates moves toward the Republic's theory of the good, or the Phaedo's argument for the immortality of the soul, his reasoning assumes a confidence in principles that stand above contingent agreement among speakers. The logic ascends from the particular cases to the form, the essence, or the ultimate cause of things. In short, the Elencus becomes dialectic in a way that is less about exposing ignorance and more about harvesting knowledge if one accepts the premises and the metaphysical commitments that accompany them. This is a genuine discrepancy. The early method is diagnostic and reputationally humble, the late method is constructive and metaphysically ambitious. Some readers find in this arc a natural evolution of a philosophic temperament, from distrust of mere persuasion and cleverness to a belief that some things can be argued into clarity, even if the path runs through abstract forms and necessity. Others find the shift troubling. If Socrates was always the man who refuses to claim knowledge, how can one reconcile his late-stage claims, iterations of virtue as knowledge, or the primacy of the form of the good, with the early insistence that he knows only one thing, his own ignorance? The answer often proposes a dual inheritance, Socrates as a methodological skeptic in local matters and as a dialectical seeker of universal justifications in the broader theoretical landscape, with the caveat that Plato's dramatic goals might influence the portrayal. Discrepancies in the sphere of content: what counts as knowledge, virtue, and the good. A second and more content-driven set of discrepancies concerns the very objects of inquiry. Early discussions of virtue, piety, wisdom, and courage tend to be treated as empirical or at least practice-bound topics. What kind of action counts as pious? What is the right kind of courage in a given situation? And so on. Socrates slots into conversations with the sophists and with young Athenians who care about reputation, wealth, and status, staking a methodological position that moral knowledge must be definable and universally applicable if it is to resist the caprices of social pressure. The Elenchus aims to expose vacuity or inconsistency in a claim about virtue or piety and then to push toward a more satisfying account. In the later works, the very assignment of the object shifts. Virtue can be treated as knowledge. Knowledge itself expands into a more general theory of the soul, the good, and immaterial form structures that govern reality. The famous, but contested, claim that virtue as knowledge appears in a form that demands justification beyond particular cases. If virtue is knowledge, then wrongdoing becomes a form of ignorance, rather than a freely chosen undermining of will. That move entails a metaphysical commitment. If we are ignorant, we can be corrected through learning. If we resist knowledge, we resist the path to the good. The discrepancy here is both logical and ontological. Early Socrates appears as a critic of conventional beliefs about virtue. Late Socrates appears as a proponent of an ontological framework in which virtue is anchored in the knowable forms and in a rational account of the soul's ascent toward truth. The Meno problem and the learning problem illustrate this tension vividly. In the Meno, Socrates defers to an almost paradoxical solution to the problem of knowledge: virtue might be remembered rather than learned, anamnesis. The dialogue uses a psychological and methodological move to bridge the gap between inquiry and knowledge. But the later dialogues find themselves in need of a more robust account, not merely how one comes to know virtue, but what the nature of virtue is and how the soul can attain objective, unchanging knowledge about it. The discrepancy is not simply about whether one can teach virtue, it becomes about what virtue is, what knowledge means, and what it means for knowledge to be universal and stable. A final layer of discrepancy arises when we compare the rhetoric of early dialogues with the assertive metaphysical claims of later ones. The early Socrates is often presented as leveraging irony and irony-laden dialogue to puncture pretensions. The later Socrates, as the Platonic speaker, participates in a system of arguments that requires a certain logical externalism. If the form of the good is the cause of all knowledge, then philosophy has a legitimate project with sequences of reasoning that can guide the soul toward truth. The logic has shifted from probing and destabilizing to structuring and legitimating. The gap between these tones, humility and certainty, stratagem and system, constitutes a fundamental discrepancy in how their logic is deployed across the corpus. Discrepancies in the sphere of aims: moral reform versus metaphysical justification. A central interpretive tension concerns the aims of the Socratic method. In the early texts, the aim is often moral reform, to awaken conscience, to undermine sophistry, to encourage a more examined life, and to prevent credence and rhetorical cunning from passing for wisdom. The Elenchus, properly understood, is a therapeutic instrument. It unsettles complacency, it invites self-scrutiny, and it serves as a pedagogical device to catalyze moral growth. The philosophical payoff is not guaranteed, and the narrator's job is to present a process whose success cannot be guaranteed within the dialogue alone. In the later texts, the aim appears to broaden or even shift. The dialectical method is deployed to justify a rationalist anthropology and an epistemology that places universal knowledge, and hence ethical ordering, on a firm metaphysical footing. This is not merely moral reform in a practical sense, it's a claim about what is ultimately real and knowable. The soul's ascent, the season of virtue as knowledge, the eternal forms, all of these are not merely tools for moral improvement but components of a comprehensive cognitive architecture that makes sense of the entire order of things. The discrepancy, here, is not only about technique but about where the ultimate aim lies. Is philosophy a therapy that helps us be better, or is it a science that makes us know what virtue is and how it bears on every decision? Discrepancies in the sphere of reliability. How reliable is the portrayal? Even more troubling are the methodological discrepancies that arise when one asks, whom do we trust for the logic? If we accept that Plato's early dialogues present Socrates more or less as he would have been, and if we accept that later dialogues present him in a more elaborate metaphysical frame, we confront a potential conflict in the reliability of the chain of reasoning. The question is not merely about whether Socrates actually believed in the forms or whether virtue is knowledge, it is about whether one should read the early Elenchus as a faithful summary of Socratic practice or as a literary and philosophical device designed by Plato. The later texts may preserve a genuine shift in thought, or they may preserve a different kind of Socratic figure, one whose aims are aligned with Plato's broader philosophical program. Either way, the discrepancies challenge readers to ask whether they are watching a single-minded work or a conversation shaped by a circle of authors with distinct aims. Case studies: how these discrepancies play out in select dialogues. Euthyphro. Here the method is overtly diagnostic. The young Socratic interlocutor arraigns piety as a family creed or a public custom, while Socrates insists on a definition that would apply across times, places, and cases. The attempt to pin down piety becomes a test of whether the definition can accommodate every instance and counterexample without collapsing into circular justification. The result is a notable aporia. The dialogue ends with the sense that piety cannot be captured by a singular, stable definition, or at least that such a definition resists easy articulation. The logic is emblematic of early Elenchus, to show the insufficiency of accepted definitions, not to present a comprehensive theory of piety. Meno. The problem of virtue's teachability becomes a fulcrum for a deeper methodological shift. Socrates challenges the assumption that virtue is a teachable craft. If virtue is knowledge of how to act for the good, what is the mechanism by which this knowledge is transmitted? The famous recollection argument, how can one learn virtue if there is nothing to learn, appears as a cunning move to bridge the gap between experience and knowledge. The Meno thus displays a logic that is still diagnostic, but it already leans toward a more systematic claim: if knowledge exists, it must have a form that can be accessed or recollected, hinting at a theory of forms and a cognitive path to universal truths. The discrepancy from the Euthyphro pattern is subtle but telling, a shift from procedural examination to a theoretical proposition about the source and transmission of knowledge. Gorgias. The dialogue that most clearly unsettles the assumption that the Socratic method is just heuristic. Here Socrates sets up a stark contrast between rhetoric and philosophy, insisting that to persuade without knowledge of the good is to abuse one's power. The logic moves beyond cross-examination to a normative critique. Knowledge, not persuasive charm, must govern action. The discrepancy here is not only substantive, rhetoric as a tool used ethically or unethically, but also methodological. The chain of arguments becomes intricate and is meant to defend a principle about the good and the right that depends on a particular account of knowledge and its importance in guiding conduct. The result is a more ambitious, system-building form of argument, moving away from a mere test of a definition toward a defense of a philosophical moral order. Phaedo and Republic. These works present perhaps the most striking example of late Socratic logic. Dialogue is a staged argument for the permanence of realities beyond the visible world. The method is now anchored in demonstrations, syllogisms, and a hierarchical ascent from opinion to knowledge to the form of the good. The education of the soul becomes an explicit aim, and the logic is designed to justify the leaps from the sensible to the intelligible. This is a far cry from the aporetic, often ironically framed questions of the early Euthyphro. The discrepancy is stark, from a practical, corrective method to a grand metaphysical science. The risk here is that the reader might see a single mind or a consistent set of principles, when in fact the text may reflect distinct intellectual projects with overlapping actors, motives, and audiences. Interpreting the evolution, 2 accounts, 1 tension. Scholars have often debated whether these discrepancies signify a real evolution in Socratic thought or are artifacts of literary and doctrinal purposes. 2 broad accounts offer helpful ways to think about the issue. The continuity account. This view treats the apparent shifts as a single, coherent trajectory. The less glamorous, more historically cautious version would say, Socrates began with a method aimed at moral reform, the elenchus and the culture of zealous inquiry, and, through exposure to a wide range of questions about human life, gradually came to articulate a more comprehensive theory of virtue, knowledge, and the form of the good. The later dialogues are not contradictions but stages of a single project that expands from practical critique to a rigorous epistemology. The discontinuity account. This view stresses the textual and dramatic reasons for the differences. Plato, and perhaps Xenophon, may have crafted the later dialogues to advance a systematic metaphysical program, which required presenting Socrates as a philosopher who has a theory of universals, teleology, and the soul. In this account, the shift from elenchus to dialectic is not a matter of evolving logic in Socrates but of the author's goals and the intellectual milieu that demands a rationalist, form-based account of reality. The early Socratic method is preserved as a pedagogical technique within a different philosophical framework. Most readers of the portraits in between these poles acknowledge that both views have merit. The evolution is real, but it is not uniform or unidirectional. It is often a dialogue between technique and theory, a conversation between the practical art of questioning and the ambitious architecture of philosophical system building. The discrepancies are not merely nuisances to be reconciled, they are the very signs that philosophy, in the Socratic mode, grows by moving between the concrete and the abstract, the ethical and the ontological, the art of asking and the art of arguing. Relevance for the modern reader: what the evolution teaches us about the Socratic method. If we attend closely to these discrepancies, several practical and philosophical insights emerge. The method is not a static toolbox but a living practice. The elenchus remains a powerful instrument, but its power depends on how interlocutors are positioned within a larger argumentative structure. The method's efficacy lies in its ability to force an interlocutor to confront the limits of their own belief and to push toward clarity, even if the path to categorical knowledge remains contested. The boundaries between thinking and doing blur. Early dialogues emphasize moral reform through examination, later dialogues insist that knowledge of the good legitimates action and affords a life of philosophical contemplation. The evolution shows how ethical life and rational justification can be braided together into a single project, even as the exact claims about what is knowable shift. The role of the audience and the authorial voice matters. The early Socrates speaks through a pattern of questions that invite assent or admission of ignorance. The later Socrates speaks as a character within a carefully constructed argumentative edifice. The method's appearance changes with the voice telling the story, reminding readers that every Socratic method is, ultimately, a form of rhetoric in the hands of a dramatist and a philosopher. Discrepancies invite cautious reading. The tension between the claim that virtue is knowledge and the earlier attacks on the teachability of virtue pushes readers to consider the relationship between virtue, knowledge, and practice. It warns against reading any single dialogue as a definitive record of Socrates' entire philosophical program. The most instructive approach is to read the dialogues as a conversation across time, in which the method evolves as part of a broader inquiry into what counts as reason, what counts as evidence, and what counts as a life well lived. Concluding reflections: the evolution is invitation, not verdict. Chapter 4 has traced a set of discrepancies in the logic and aims across the early and later presentations of Socrates. The evolution of the Socratic method, if we can call it that, is not a linear ascent from ignorance to certainty but a complex negotiation among technique, theory, and dramatic purpose. The early elenchus teaches us the value of disciplined questioning, the courage to admit one's own epistemic limits, and the moral invitation to examine life. The later dialectic invites us to imagine a rational order in which definitions, causes, and forms provide a secure foundation for both knowledge and virtue. The two moments are not enemies but grammatically different clauses of the same sentence, a life of inquiry that begins with the courage to ask and ends, if one accepts the philosophical program, with the responsibility to answer, to justify, and to live according to the best understanding we can reach. In the final tally, the discrepancies between early and late logic do not undermine Socrates' method, they illuminate its richness. They reveal a thinker who refuses to be pigeonholed into a single mode of reasoning, who is willing to let his method morph as he and his audiences confront new problems, and who remains committed to the idea that good reasoning, properly pursued, can guide both individuals and communities toward a more examined and more humane life. For A Portrait of Socrates, The Socratic Method, as the book promises, a chapter that emphasizes evolution and discrepancy is not a deviation from the core project but a necessary exposure of its living, breathing complexity. The journey from elenchus to dialectic is, in this sense, not a detour but the path itself, the evolution of a method that keeps asking, keeps testing, and, crucially, keeps inviting us to think more clearly about what we claim to know, and why it matters for how we live.